Good morning. Welcome to the March edition of the Kauffman FastTrac Author Series. My name is Alana Mueller. I'm the president of Kauffman FastTrac, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. Our guest author is Maurya. He bootstrapped his last company, WiredReach, a simple file and media sharing product developer, in 2002, which he sold in late 2010. Throughout that time, he launched many products with varying degrees of success and was constantly in search for a better way to build products. He tried everything from building in stealth, release early, release often, less is more, and even more is more. In late 2009, he ran into Steve Blank's lectures on customer development, from where he followed the trail to Eric Ries's early ideas on the lean startup. That started his own rigorous testing and adaptation of these ideas, which he first shared on his blog, ashmaurya.com, and has turned into a book, Running Lean, which has sold over 10,000 copies. Currently, he is the founder and CEO of Spark 59, whose mission is to help other startups raise their odds of success. He has worked with hundreds of startups, which helped refine the Running Lean methodology and identify several problems worth solving that he is helping to turn into products. He's a mentor with startup accelerators around the world, including Mozilla Foundation in San Francisco, Year One Labs in Montreal, Mars in Toronto, Ideally in Brussels, and Capital Factory in Austin. Ash holds a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from Rochester Institute of Technology. Please join me in welcoming Maurya to the Kauffman FastTrac Author Series.
Thank you very much, Alana. Thank you very much, Kim. Can you pass over control so I can share screen?
You should have it now.
All right, and I'm assuming you can see my screen come in now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for that introduction. That was yeah, pretty much my whole talk right there. No, I'm just kidding. I'm actually going to walk through a few slides just talking about the methodology that I'm going to share with you here in a second. I'll throw a little bit of my background. I like to throw a few concrete stories in there, try to get through them pretty quickly, and then open up for questions. So if people listening have questions, you can type them in the chat box or the question box. We'll collect them, and in the end, we'll go through as many of them as time permits. So by way of introduction, some of you might know that I've written this book, and oftentimes people look at me more as a consultant or a speaker, author at this point. But I like to remind people that first and foremost, I'm an entrepreneur, and I spend most of my time still building products. So a lot of the speaking that I do is really more of a side thing. And so with that, I hate to start with bad news, but this is the sad reality, is that most products fail, most startups fail. And most of you should already know the stat, and whether the number is 90% or a little bit lower, a little bit higher, it's irrelevant. It's just a very high number. The more interesting number, though, is that 2/3 of the companies that report success also report drastically changing their plans along the way. So what that really tells us is that the successful entrepreneurs don't succeed by way of having that perfect plan A or that perfect business model, business vision, but rather finding a plan that works before running out of resources. That initial perfect plan is really a myth. And the key part here is going to be finding that plan that works before running out of resources. That's usually the #1 killer of products, of startups. And that's the process that I want to share with you today. So Running Lean is heavily grounded in lean startups and customer development. In the intro, Lana pointed out how I was influenced by a lot of the early works of Steve Blank and Eric Ries. I'll share a little bit more on how that came about, but the core process here is really one of trying to build a systematic way of going from that initial plan that we have to one that works, and again, the key part there is before running out of resources. So I'll take a step back and kind of take a look at why building products or building startups is so hard. And there is this myth that we have, the myth of the visionary entrepreneur, which looks something like this. So when we look at our product, we typically don't look at anything else but the solution. That's what I like to call awesome. That's what we're in love with. And this is very prevalent. I've talked and worked with many entrepreneurs, and I was this way myself. And down below I have a quote by Mark Zuckerberg where he started Facebook because it was really something cool, something awesome. And the quote that's down there, he said this not when he was just starting out, but after he had acquired millions of users. He had been on many of the college campuses. He had moved to Silicon Valley, raised a big round of funding. And even then, he thought he was just having fun. He didn't think this was a real company. because he was having too much fun doing it. He thought in a few years he would actually quit Facebook and go start a real business. So that's just how we perceive our products. And sometimes that awesome is truly awesome for a lot of people, like in Facebook's case. But more often than not, it doesn't kind of turn out that way automatically. The other side that keeps us up at night, so as entrepreneurs, we fall in love with, we get an idea, we fall in love with the solution, we rush to start building it, but we kind of have to put the brakes on because we have to figure out how we establish enough runway. We have to figure out how we give ourselves enough time to build this product out. And oftentimes the first place we turn to are people with bags of money. So whether these are internal stakeholders in a company or external stakeholders in the form of investors, angel, or venture, we look to them to say, please fund us. I've got this awesome idea, and please give me money so I can go bring it to life. The investors are in this business for one reason and one reason alone, and that's to get a return on their investment. And so when they look at your solution, as much passion as you show, that's not really what gets their attention. What really gets their attention is something known as traction. So they want to see, is there any evidence that your solution has any traction with people other than yourself? And traction is nothing more than engagement with your customers or your markets. So are people other than you and your friends saying this is a good product or using this product? Can you show me evidence of that? That's usually the first thing that they look for. Outside that, if you've got some engagement with your product, they want to know, well, what is the business model economic story? So what is the intersection between your cost structure and your revenue streams? Essentially, how will you make money over time? They don't care about who your customers really are, but they do care about how many they are. So what is the overall problem size or market size? And then finally, if you are successful, how do you build in defensibility? How do you ward off competition as copycats enter the market or existing competition tries to encroach in your space? How will you defend against that? So those are the kinds of things they want to know because, again, in their mind, they're trying to de-risk your product as an investment for them. And at the earliest stages, the thing that matters the most of all of these things is going to be evidence of traction, because that just shows that you have something that's getting some uptake, even however small. So if we look, kind of dissect into traction and say, rather than going after people with bags of money, if we can get some early traction, we'll have a much easier conversation. So if we look at what traction is, it's nothing more than engagement with your customers. So why don't we start there instead? Similarly, if we look at what customers see when we show them our product or our startup, they too don't fall in love automatically with the solution. People don't wake up and say, I need to go buy an app that was written in Java or Django or Ruby on Rails. It's not the technology that gets them excited. It's really the fact that they have problems they want solved, and they're not in love with those problems, but they do pay attention to people that can promise them a solution to those problems. So the intersection between their solutions and ideally their must-have problems and your solution is what we call the value proposition or the promise, and that's really what gets their attention. If you can deliver a compelling promise, you've got their attention. Otherwise, you're just one of many products that are out there claiming to do things that they probably don't really care about. To make the promise strong, it helps to basically further segment your customers, so not really try to market to the mainstream. So we all would like to be a company like Facebook that has customers all over the world and millions, almost 1 billion customers. But even they started with a very specific customer segment, which happened to be a college student, which happened to be an early adopter of their product. And so when you really narrow in on your early adopters, you can make the promise a lot more compelling, a lot more specific, a lot more stronger. And that's what you need to do early on. And over time, that can be broadened once you've got other things working in your favor, like social proof and momentum from those early adopters. But in the very earliest stages, your promise has to match typically a very narrow customer segment or your early adopter segment. If you get those two things right, the next question that customers have is, how much does this cost? And I use the word currency and not really money because sometimes there is a derivative exchange of currency. And by that I mean if you were building a multi-sided market that was funded, say, with an ad-based model, in that situation, your users wouldn't be paying you actual money, but they would be paying you by way of participation or by way of giving you their attention, which you then turn around and sell to other people, in this case advertisers, for some monetary amount. So you're still looking for a currency of exchange. For the value proposition that you're offering, you're looking for something for users to give you, the quid pro quo going on there. And that's what you need to lay out. And of all of these things, what gets the customer's attentions is the promise. If you have a strong enough promise, they pay attention to you, they give you permission to talk about these other things. But if you don't get their attention, typical landing page tests have shown that people would visit a landing page and within 5 to 8 seconds make a determination of whether they want to stick around or whether they want to leave. So you have a very small window of making that promise compelling enough, and that's that job of that unique value proposition. So the reason I showed you all of this is to define or maybe redefine what the true product of an entrepreneur is. It's not the product we typically think about. It's not the solution, which is what most entrepreneurs think they're truly building. We all think if you build something great enough, everything kind of falls in place. The business model falls in place. The business plan can be written after the fact because we just have a product that's just so great and awesome. And that, as I said, oftentimes doesn't quite work out that way for many products. So the solution isn't really the true product that we are building, but rather this canvas that I'm showing, that I've been building up slowly. It's really encompasses the core hypotheses, the core assumptions that go behind the business model. And that's the true product we're building. Now, each of these components in here, whether it's the problem, the customer segment, cost structure, channels, they're all jigsaw puzzles that have to come together at the end, and they all have to work together, and that is the true product. So we're redefining what the product is. We're also redefining the job of an entrepreneur. It's not just to build, but it's rather to systematically de-risk this business model. So the reason I put question marks here is that even though we may be pretty confident that we have a compelling business model on day one, no business model really stands the test of customers. There's going to be this change. So what I started out with is even the most successful companies like Groupons, like Google, like PayPal, they've all refined their business model along the years to find something that works. So what we really think is going to work day one is not necessarily where we end up. And so the job really is one of starting somewhere, but then quickly de-risking that vision systematically through experiments, through conversations with customers, with a whole bunch of other people. So we start with customers, but we have conversations with our team on what it is we build, what we learn from customers. There's a whole feedback loop there, which I'll talk about here in a second. We have other conversations with advisors, with investors if you have them, and there'll be different kinds of conversations with each of these groups. And then we finally also have conversations with competitors, and I put these at the end because oftentimes entrepreneurs get too wary of competitors. They look at competition and they either kill their ideas prematurely or they start mimicking competition, and both of those are predicated on the fact that your competitors have a clue about what their customers really want. And if that is the case, then you may be in trouble already. And if that isn't the case, just trying to copy a competitor that's as clueless as you are is not going to guarantee success. So I usually leave competition off to the end. Typically, you have to have conversations when you start getting some level of success. So when Facebook started taking off, there were dozens, if not more than that, several dozen copycats and competitors beginning to just clone what they were doing, trying to encroach in their space. And that's a form of a conversation. So those conversations will happen, whether they're in the form of pricing or features or other axes of your product. You will have those conversations, but they're better left for much later than day one. The first conversations you should be engaging with are starting with customers, team, and then going around in that clockwise manner. So just a little bit about myself. From the intro, you probably got a sense that I've been doing this for a number of years. I've built many products over the years and tried many different methodologies. The most kind of the starting one being stealth, and then a whole bunch of things in between. What I really observed is that the cycle time between my products, so I had varying success. Some of them outright failed. Some of them had mixed success. Some of them had much better success. But what I found is that my cycle time between those products was typically 1 to 2 years, and that was just a very long cycle time. And I was looking for better, faster ways to vet these new product ideas when I got them. So I often like to say is that everyone gets hit by ideas, but entrepreneurs, for some crazy reason, choose to act on them. But we can't act on every idea we get, because then we are kind of defocused and we can't expend the effort that we need to really bring something to fruition. So for me, it was more important to kind of vet that, and I began searching for this process, which is what I'll now go into and give you a few, I'll give you a high-level kind of overview of what that methodology really looks like. So a few disclaimers I like to throw out there is everything I'm going to share with you is built on first-hand experiential learning, and I encourage you to do the same. So there are no silver bullets. There is no magic process here. Everything we talk about in the lean startup, in the lean world, are really meta principles. So there are some basic principles, which I'll share here in a second, that kind of embody what you should be doing, but you need to separate the principles from the tactics. I often find people sometimes just copying tactics, saying that, well, Dropbox used these lean startup techniques and they did this one tactic with their demo, so if I do the same thing, I'll get success. And that may or may not work depending on your audience, depending on your product. So I would just encourage you to look at, first internalize the principles, and then from there borrow and learn the right tactics that need to be adopted to your particular product. So let's jump right into the principles then, and they're simple. They're just 3 of them. And I would just come out and say that the underlying kind of premise behind these principles was an epiphany that I had a couple years ago, which was something I shared with you just a second ago, or sorry, a minute ago. That was this understanding that the product wasn't the solution we were building, but the business model. And if you look at the business model as a product, we can apply the same types of techniques we use to build regular kind of products to the business model. So the first principle in play here is one of planning. So documenting your plan A, that's what the first one is. And it's not just planning, but it's deconstruction. Taking a very complex problem like building a complex product and, a complex business, and then bringing it into its component pieces, and I'll show you how we do that. And then the next step here is identifying the riskiest parts of that. So rather than trying to start with what's easy, we want to start with what's risky, and then we finally want to systematically tackle those risks. And that's really the meta principles in a nutshell. So if we dive a little bit deeper into each one of those, the reason it's important to start with some planning, with some documentation of your plan A, is that as entrepreneurs, we are especially gifted at building these reality distortion fields around ourselves. No matter what news we are presented with, good or bad, we can always find a way to rationalize it and convince ourselves that we were right. So if a product wasn't selling, well, it was because, well, we just came out of the summer months or there was some festival going on. I just came out of South by Southwest. So I could say, well, everyone was distracted, and so that's why nobody was buying. We just need to give ourselves a little bit more time. And so you can always rationalize these kinds of things, and that's not what we want to do. We want to bring in more objectivity. You will see there's a big lean in the lean methodology. There's a big emphasis on empirical learning and objective learning, and so we want to bring more facts than faith into the kinds of experiments or the kinds of tasks that we do with our products. And I'll talk about what an experiment really is in a second here. Traditionally, we have used business plans for capturing these core starting assumptions. And I know a number of you in the audience have probably written a business plan before. Typically, if I can see the audience, I ask them to raise their hands if they've written a business plan, and I ask them to keep their hands up if they enjoy the process. A few hands stay up, but most of the hands typically go down because the business plan is not exactly the most enjoyable task that we are asked to do. And oftentimes, the people who make us do these things, the investors, don't read the entire business plan themselves because it was really meant to be an exercise for the entrepreneur. And while it's a good exercise, it goes a little bit overboard because it's too big of a document. It takes too long to write, and sometimes what you end up putting there ends up being more based in fiction than facts. When you start planning out what your projected revenues will be 5 years from now, or what your office will cost, how many people you will hire, all of those they're too far into the future for you to make any meaningful extrapolations. So that's where the business model falls apart a little bit. It's just it's the wrong format. It has the right idea but the wrong format. So in comparison to that, there's another kind of approach that we take in the lean world called just the one-page business model. And I'll show you what that looks like. It's really a lot of the same things that would go into your business plan, only put on a single page in a condensed manner. So if you've done a business plan before, you'll recognize a lot of these boxes, the key metrics, the channels, customer segments. Those are all the core assumptions that you'd want to test anyways. And if you were going to talk to an investor, they wouldn't read the entire business plan anyways. They would ask for a one-page executive summary, or they would ask for a 10-page slide deck or a 30-second elevator pitch. So they're looking for a condensed version of your business plan anyways. So why don't you just start with that, especially since your original vision is going to be way off. It's probably going to change a lot. So why waste the several weeks building up a 60-page business plan deck when you can actually write something in 15 to 20 minutes and then refine it continually from there on out. And that's the core idea behind this one-page business model. And so this is the lean canvas format that I created. It's a derivative work off of the original business model canvas, which some of you may be familiar with. So this was finished. This was a PhD work that took place in Switzerland. Alex Osterwalder finished off the work, and this is what the original canvas looks like. I've highlighted some of the changes that I made, and I'll just say that I made those changes to make the canvas a lot more approachable, at least from a lean sense. I wanted to replace some of the boxes here that tend to be a little more abstract, a little bit more latter stage, and make the lean canvas be a lot more actionable that way. For a more kind of comprehensive take on what those changes are and why I made them, there is a blog post that I've written, so I've just linked that over here if you're interested. And if you don't know what the business model canvas is and you don't know what lean canvas is, then you could just kind of you don't have to read this. You can just kind of just look at the content that I'm sharing kind of at its own face value. So the key point again here is one of realizing that it's not the solution that we're really trying to build. There are these other 8 boxes in the business model that truly comprise that jigsaw puzzle that eventually has to work. So the canvas helps you look at that blueprint for your company or your product as a whole. And just putting it on a single page is very powerful because, one, it takes very little time to create, and then 2, when you put that in front of people, they can't help but not read it. They can't help but not have an opinion. And the conversation that ensues is very, very valuable in helping to identify the next part, which is the identification of risks. So building a successful product, building a successful company is fundamentally about risk mitigation. I showed you one view where the investors don't invest in your solution, they invest in your risk profile. So if you've got traction, then you've automatically reduced that risk profile. If you don't have traction, they look at other proxies, which is how strong is your story, how strong is your own track record? Have you done this before? How strong is your team? So all that is risk mitigation from their point of view. But it's not just the investors who do this. Even your customers do the same thing. When you try to sell them a product, the biggest fear that customers have is that they're going to waste their time or money or effort using a product that doesn't deliver value. So before they make that decision to buy, in their mind, they are trying to mitigate risk. They're trying to see, well, why is your product going to work and all the competitors' product is not working, so why is yours going to be any better? And it's not just even customers. When you try to build a team, if you're a solo founder and you try to get a co-founder, you run into the same situation. You have an idea, you have a vision, but it's untested, it's unproven. Being able to convince someone else to either quit their job or even work with you part-time is a big risk for them. And so they have to overcome that risk in their own minds. And your job as the entrepreneur is to de-risk that startup over time so that it becomes safer and safer to build for team members to join you. It becomes safer for customers to try you, and it becomes safer for investors to put money in you. So that, in many ways, is really what our jobs truly is as entrepreneurs. There are 3 kinds of risks generally. There's product risk, which is all about getting the product right. This is typically the one we like to spend a lot of time on, but there are risks that not all risks are created equal. There is customer risk, so that's all about building paths to customers, so things like channels, things like the customer segmentation. And then there's market risk, which is building a viable business. So the intersection of your cost structure, revenue stream, your unfair advantages, those kinds of things go into play there. So during the course of the product, those risks will morph and they will change. One of the models that I like to share is this 3 stages of a startup, and so it helps to show how those risks change over time, because at different stages we're asking different questions about our product. So when we first have an idea, and this is something that I go through a lot myself, is when we first get an idea, the first question that we want to ask is this idea really worth pursuing? Is this really a problem worth solving in the first place? And in the way that we do this is, rather than rushing to build something and going away into the metaphorical garage and locking ourselves for several months, What we instead want to do is get outside the building and go talk to prospects, go talk to potential customers, and share the problems we're trying to solve with them, share even demos of the solution. So not building out the solution, but coming up with the right demo, and that right demo may be a prototype, but oftentimes you can do with far less. It could be a verbal description of what you're trying to do. It could be a screenshot or a mock-up or something pretty small, something enough to where the customer can see, can connect the dots on how you would solve the problem for them. And if you've nailed the right problem, they will get very excited and they will give you that permission to go on to that next step. So that's what we try to do here. And what we are really trying to do is come up with this concept of the minimum viable product. So at the end of this whole process, at first stage, we're trying to come up with a definition of the smallest solution that will deliver customer value, not the final solution. So even, I'll throw an extreme example out there, and I'll just talk about the iPhone. So when the iPhone 1 came out, there were lots of missing features in there, things like cut and paste, things like multitasking, and people, the critics were saying, oh, how can Apple release such a product and miss out on those basic features? It's not that they didn't want to build those features, it's that they wanted to build something quick and fast, and their biggest risk was, can we take three big problems? They wanted to combine an iPod, a browser, and a phone into one device, into the iPhone, and that was really what they wanted to do. Everything else could come later. Everything else was kind of feature parity for them. So for them, coming up with that minimal definition, that minimum viable product, was what they were most focused on, and that's what we want to do in this first step. We want to figure out what is that smallest solution we build that delivers value, and as a bonus, ideally capture some of that value. And that's just a fancy way of saying getting paid. This is often a topic I spend some time talking about. I wouldn't spend a lot of time here, but many people hide away from charging customers from day one because they do feel like what they have released is just so minimal. It's a beta or an alpha, and we don't charge customers, and I think that is the exact wrong approach. If you're delivering value, you should put a price to it, and you should start testing price, because that is one of the most riskiest parts of your business model. If you can't charge your customers at the end of the day, you have no business in that business model. So that's something to keep in mind. So once you've got that MVP definition built, we then move on to the second stage, which is we go and build that minimum viable product. And now the question we ask ourselves in the product market fit stage is, have I built something people want? And a key insight here is you don't need lots of users to learn here. So oftentimes you find people trying to expend a lot of energy premature optimizing their channels, so trying to get a lot of people to try their product in the hopes that they will all convert. When you first launch a product, there are going to be lots of issues with it, so it's better served for you to actually focus on a handful of customers in batches and test your product that way. Make sure it's good enough first before you scale out. So that's kind of a lean approach kind of applied there. The other thing is when you open it up to a lot of people, you tend to get a lot of mixed information. So if your segmentation is very broad, you might get distracted and get asked to do 100 different things. While if you stay focused and you start with a small group of people, that's actually a gift, because you can get to know your customers very well. You can get to interact with them much more closely and get that product to a place where it's good enough much quicker, which is kind of counterintuitive, but it gets there much faster than if you open it up to everyone. Now, once you have a product that's starting to work, that's when you shift into the scale stage. And that's where the big question is one of acceleration. So how do you accelerate growth here? And what we're then doing is looking for this concept that Eric Ries has popularized, and he talks about this in his book, The Lean Startup, is we're looking for these engines of growth. And there are typically three kinds of engines of growth, and we're trying to figure out which of those engines can we raise the knobs on and get our product in front of a lot of people. So we know it works at small scale. Can we now scale it out and realize the vision at that larger scale? And that's where the focus goes on that third stage. So I'm going to now take a step and talk about how we test these things. So along the way, I've mentioned how lean is heavily rooted in kind of the scientific method, and there are these concepts of experimentation. So I'll define what that is. So I'm going to assume that a number of you are familiar with lean startups by now. It's something that started 3 years ago, and it's been popularized quite a bit over the years. But this is the fundamental kind of core idea in the lean startup, and it's one of running an experiment. So I'll quickly walk through this loop. This is the build, measure, learn loop that Eric Ries codified about 3 years ago. It starts at the very top with ideas. So we have hypotheses, assumptions, or ideas. We go into a build stage where we build some aspect of a product. It doesn't have to be the final solution. In fact, it shouldn't be the final solution. It should be some proxy of it. So we build some aspect of a product. It could be that screenshot or mock-up or a small feature. We then put that in front of customers and we collect data. So this can either be qualitative, and we collect that in the form of interviews. So there may be usability tests or customer interviews that we run. We may just go and observe people using the product. All those are qualitative ways of learning. We may also have quantitative approaches where we instrument our application or our product, where we collect data, we collect usage data from a wide number of users using it, and we use that data to then learn. And the learning has to be grounded in customer learning. So it's not enough to have just built a product that is defect-free. It's way more important to build a product that's ideally defect-free. That's not the most important thing, but that it gets used by customers and they have an opinion about whether that feature or that product is good enough or not. So that's where the learning has to end. And then that learning is what's used to build the next set of ideas, which then kind of feeds back into this loop. So each cycle around this loop is what we call an experiment. And rather than, so in a traditional product development cycle, we would just run one big experiment. We'd go and gather requirements from customers. We'd spend months or years building a product, and then we'd go put it out there, and then that's where we'd learn. And oftentimes that middle is where we go astray, because we spend those months or years building something, not talking to customers, and so when we put it out there, customers say, well, that's not what we really wanted, and that's when the true learning begins, and we start this loop again. But oftentimes we spend those months or years and we are low on resources and we pretty much end up failing. So what we're trying to change with this process is incorporating 3 aspects here. One is speed. So we want to make these loops as small as possible. So rather than spending those months or years of building one release, one iteration of the product, what if we actually went out there and built a very small version of our product that was still good enough for learning, and we could learn very quickly if we were on the right track or not. So a very extreme example of this is if you were trying to go market a product, if you just started with your landing page and were able to run a smoke test and see if anyone was interested in your product just based on the fact that you were advertising the product on the landing page, would be a way of testing if there was enough demand for it. So if there is no demand on the landing page, then why build the rest of the product? So that's kind of an extreme example of that. So what we want to do is run these small experiments and go around these loops as quickly as possible. So speed is very critical. At the end of every one of these loops, it has to end in customer learning, which I talked about already. And then the other aspect, which is equally important, is one of focus. We want to make sure we are focused on the right kinds of ideas and the right kinds of experiments. Otherwise, we run into the premature optimization trap, which I'll illustrate here with this Venn diagram. So when you're running an experiment, it's very important to have speed, learning, and focus. You have to have all 3 things. And if you don't, you run into a number of different problems. So if you're going very fast and you're super focused, but you're not learning from customers, you're not learning anything about customers, that's the classic kind of waterfall or following a plan approach. So you might build something to spec. It might be quote-unquote perfect because it was built as per spec. But if that plan was wrong, you're just going to be chasing your tail because you will never get customers to pick up your product, and you will always be coming up with the next thing to go build. But if you're not learning, you just keep chasing your tail. If you're not going fast enough, you're learning the right things, and you are super focused, that's the trap of running out of resources. So you're going too slow, you will eventually run out of money, time, effort, maybe hope. Maybe a competitor will come in and outpace you, and so those are all kind of real dangers that you run into going down that path. And then finally, this is the premature optimization trap, which is also very common, and that's where you're going super fast, you are learning, which are both very good things, but if you're focused on the wrong things, if you're, for example, trying to optimize a landing page when you don't have a product yet built, that's an example of premature optimization. Or if you're trying to scale your servers to support millions of users when you only have 0 users at the moment, that's an example of premature optimization. So there's a point of diminishing returns where you need to have, obviously, enough effort put into a landing page or into your code so that it does work, but it doesn't have to be optimized to work at scale because you're not at scale yet. So that's a trap that you can run into. So that's why I kind of illustrate that here. So you need to have all of these 3 things. And to show you a visual of how a startup typically goes from idea to product market fit, this visual will help. So when we first start out, I encourage people to create not one of those business model canvases, but many of them. So they're so quickly to create that you can come up with variations. So if you think that graphic designers could be your market, you could sketch out a canvas with them as the customer segment. If you think that maybe the product could also be used by, say, architects or, say, a different vertical like photographers, who might create different variations of that. And you'll find that the business model will change drastically. So when you're trying to sell something to a professional photographer versus a graphic designer, the price points might change, the channels will change, a lot of it will change. And so by putting those variations next to each other, time boxing that effort, so you're not spending weeks but rather a day or two doing this, it's a good exercise to weed out the strong business models from those that may not be so strong. So that's the first step. Once you have a handful of them, I typically say no more than 3. You then identify what's risky on those business models. So you start by saying, based on the stage that I'm in, maybe I need to go test my customer segment. Maybe I need to go test if anyone will pay for this product. So identify what's risky on them. And then you go into these stages of experimentation. So I've already walked through the 3 stages, so I wouldn't do it again. But the first stage is really one of understanding the problems. So you talk to customers, try to understand if you're addressing the right kinds of problems. You then start to define solutions. And at each of these steps, you might be tackling multiple business models at once, but you begin to get signals that eliminate some along the way. So at some point, you have to kind of hone in on a single business model that you take to completion. So this is the one that's in the middle here. So we have gone through understanding the problem, defining the solution, which would be the minimum viable product. We then test at small scale, which is validated qualitatively, and then we scale this out to product market fit. And that's what the kind of final solution looks like. So that's really the overview of the methodology. One thing that I like to share at the end is a concrete example. So I think it helps to put a lot of these principles together. I'll walk through an example, and I like to pick a very simple example. So rather than picking a software or hardware example that I've probably worked with in the past, I pick a product which a lot of people can relate to. It doesn't require domain expertise to understand, and that is one of writing a book. So I wrote my own book using every technique that I've showed you here, every one of these principles, and I use a lot of different techniques to figure out if this was, to basically write the book and figure out if there was something worth doing. So I want to quickly walk through that because I find it's an example that people can easily relate to, and it doesn't require that domain knowledge to it. And in fact, it's so kind of meta-recursive, which some of the more technical folks will appreciate, is that the second chapter of the book is actually a case study on how I wrote the book. So I went back and put that in the book because I think it's a pretty telling story of how a lot of the stuff evolved over time. So I'll just go back in time, and in October of 2009, I started a blog. So I'll start the story off where I talked about kind of having this desire for finding better, faster ways to vet product ideas, and I was trying all these different methodologies. I came across Eric Ries and Steve Blank's work and decided to test some of those ideas. But as I started to put them to test, I realized that there was a lot that was still missing. It was very early stage. It was very early days. And so I decided to write a blog and share my own learning very transparently in the hopes that people would have pity on me and maybe give me good advice along the way. So I was just very transparent. I took one of my products and turned it into sort of a test lab for these lean techniques. And along the way, a number of people began suggesting that I turn these blog posts into a book, or they started asking about that if I had interest in doing it. And at first, while I was flattered, I kind of just laughed it off and said, no, I'm just too busy running my own startup. I have no intentions of writing a book. But after about the 12th request, I decided to kind of investigate a little bit deeper. So I set up a couple of these problem interviews with these customers, and I would ask them, what would they want in this book? What is the value proposition of this book, and what is different about this book from everything else that's out there? There's lots of content, there's lots of blog videos, other books were being written. Like, what's going to be different about it? So I started that process, and I got some helpful information back. So it helped me understand who my customers were and what they found that was different. So like me, they too were having a hard time taking a lot of these principles to practice, and they felt that my stuff was very much of a how-to guide. It was very much of a tactical, grounds-up approach. So that seemed to be the differentiation that mattered to them. I then decided to turn, so at that point I decided, well, that's kind of interesting. So rather than jumping and writing this book, let me see if I can create something of a demo. So this would be the concept of a teaser page or a demo. I spent half an afternoon building this landing page, which was not meant to be aesthetically beautiful. It was meant to be fast, quick, and dirty. And I really wanted to test one thing and one thing alone on this page. It wasn't the title. It wasn't the book cover, obviously. It was a table of contents. So I would show this to people, and I would say, if I wrote this book with the table of contents down below, is that what you were looking for? Is that something that would be of interest? And that was a very helpful exercise. So I went back and refined the table of content multiple times till it was something that all 12 people said, yes, if you wrote this book, they would buy it. Now, getting 12 people to say they would buy a book is not really indicative of a lot of people buying it, because I had selected these people from my blog, and it was selection bias, of course. So I decided to run a much more broad kind of smoke test. And so I took that teaser page and turned it into something else. So I kind of made 3 changes here. One is I changed the title based on some feedback that I was getting from the people I interviewed. I announced that I was going to write this book over the summer. And this was March of 2009 at that time. March 2010. And so I came out and said coming this summer, which gave me about 3 to 5 months, depending on how you count the summer. And I started collecting email addresses. And then I did nothing. I just left this page up. I obviously announced it on my blog. I got a few people to help me promote it or tweet it. But I would do nothing than just watch for the emails kind of coming in. And for me, I needed to get to about 1,000 email addresses for this to be a problem worth solving. And that was a simple back-of-the-envelope calculation on how much time I estimated to write this book and what that 1,000 email address would really mean in terms of revenue. So it was a simple back-of-the-envelope math. And those didn't come right away, so it took all summer for that to come in. And when I began to write this book, I realized that a lot of the ideas had changed along the way, and so I came up with a different MVP. So I didn't want to go and write this book just yet, because writing the book was going to be a lot of effort. I instead took the table of contents and turned it into a free workshop. So I turned them into slides which looked a lot like the slides I'm sharing with you today, except without the graphics. So they were just a whole bunch of bullet points. I announced a free workshop, and I got a number of people to attend those workshops. And the idea of the workshop was to really test the content that would go into the book. So it was a sort of a minimum viable product for what would be in the book, instead of actually sitting down and writing the book for hours just by myself. I wanted to do this in a more interactive fashion. So the workshops were very helpful. People actually felt the content was good enough to where they would have paid for it. And so I decided to test paid workshops. And throughout the summer, I ran a number of paid workshops to refine the content in the book. And so I was pretty much writing my book in the form of slides. I wasn't really turning them into chapters just yet. I would go after every workshop. I would go and change up the slides, and things weren't clear. People had questions. I would go and supplement that. And eventually, by the end of the summer, I pretty much had my book in the big slide deck. It was about 300 or 500 slides. I don't remember the exact count right now, but it was huge. It was just kind of massive slide deck. And at that point, I was ready to write my book, but there was a problem. So I had promised the book coming this summer, but summer had come and gone. And so I had a number of people start asking where this book was. And so I made a deal with them. I told them that I had underestimated the writing of the book, which is very common. We do that with every project that we undertake. But that I finally had a plan on rolling out this book. But rather than going away for another 4 or 5 months writing this book, I would give them a preview chapter, and if they pre-ordered my book, I would release the book much like I release software. So I would release it every 2 weeks. I would give them 2 chapters every 2 weeks as I was writing them, and that allowed them to consume the book quicker, and it allowed them to give me feedback. And I would really appreciate if they kind of if they did that. And so the landing page, the way that kind of changed up is rather than saying coming this summer, I changed it to coming soon, because I had no idea when it would really be done at this point. I added a pre-order option with a discount. In retrospect, I wouldn't have offered a discount because I polled people afterwards, and they said the discount didn't really do anything for them. They would have happily paid full price because it's not that big of an investment. And then I still kept a way for people to, if they didn't want to go with the pre-order option, to still just be on the list. So when the book was ready, I could announce it to them. And interestingly enough, I didn't have every one of the people on my mailing list go for this, because I was writing it as a PDF. Some people said they didn't want PDF, they didn't like PDF. Others wanted to wait for the print version of the book. And all of that is fine. At first I thought, how do I solve this problem? Do I jump through hoops to come up with a non-PDF version? And then I realized that what was really happening is that my early adopters were the ones who were buying the book, and they didn't care in what format the book came in, and they were the ones I would stand to learn the most from anyways. And so I didn't jump through hoops to try to support multiple formats at this stage. I just got enough people to buy the book in the PDF form and use them to finish out the book, and then approach the other formats and other things like book covers and things like that for the book that would be packaging, but not really the core risky things that I thought were important in the book. So the 2-week releases were super helpful. They allowed people to come in and give me lots of feedback about what they liked, what they didn't like in the book. As a result, I quickly not only nixed things like typos and grammatical errors, but a lot of the content got refined over time. I would rewrite chapters just based on feedback. I would add sections in based on questions I was getting on how to effectively run interviews, how to tell if your customers aren't being truthful, things like that. So all of those kinds of things helped to make the book much more better, because it was being written for an audience versus what I thought they should read. Now, a surprising thing happened, and this was something I didn't expect. So I was always prepared to just self-publish this book, but when I was 3/4 of the way through, I got a random call from a publisher, a major publisher, saying, "We know you've been writing this book. We have read your PDF, and we'd like to publish it. And here's a book deal, and if you're interested, let's talk." And so I got on the phone, and the first thing I asked them is, why would they want to publish this book? Because it had been written as a PDF. There was no DRM. I had leaked the book out many times myself, so there were tons of copies floating around, and I thought that would be an instant concern of theirs. I want to just put that out there. And what they told me is that they didn't have any of those concerns. What they were most attracted by was the fact that I had marketed this book on my own and had sold so many copies just on my own, and they felt with their own retail and marketing muscle they could 10x that. And so that's really what they were interested in. And when they put it that way, it made complete sense. So if you're looking to get an investor to invest in your company, based on what I talked about early on, what you're really doing as an entrepreneur is, if you can de-risk your product by showing that early traction, then you're a much safer bet than if you just came there day one. So back in October 2009, if I tried to shop the book around, it would have been a much harder conversation, because nobody knew who I was. I'd never written a book before. There would have to be a lot of due diligence done on my ability to write, on the topic, on the audience. While, if you do, when I did that 9 months later, it was a very different conversation. So that made complete sense, but it was not, again, completely clear. It was not completely obvious to me when I first got that. It was more of a surprise. But so on the publisher side, I told them I had committed to finishing this book, so I first decided to finish the first edition of the book as a self-published book and then revisit publishing later, which the book has been republished as a second edition much later, but I wanted to kind of finish that off. So once the book was finally finished in February of 2010, it's at that time that I went back and worked on things like the book cover. So I got a graphic designer to do that, invested more in the marketing copy, got some testimonials, and luckily enough, the people who will give you testimonials are your early adopters, so they tend to give you good testimonials, and there were some pretty famous people that had bought the PDF as well, so I was able to reach out to them, and they were more than willing to help. So they gave a lot of good testimonials. They helped to promote the book, and so all those things became easier by following this kind of a process of writing the book. Now, once that first edition was written, I didn't stop writing. So I felt like a book like large software, especially a nonfiction book, is never really finished. It's just released at some point. And so I kept writing both on blogs and newsletters. I kept running these workshops, which at the time were only an MVP. They were only a means to writing the book. But once the book came out, a lot of the ideas kept changing, and the demand for workshops actually went up. So I do run workshops. I was actually at the Kauffman Foundation, at the Kauffman Labs, not too long ago, kind of doing one of those kinds of workshops. And so those have been things that I've been doing, and they have led to yet more refinement to the book. I'm not writing a third edition, but a lot of that content still shows up in many different places. So there have been products that have come out. The Lean Canvas, which is the stuff I showed you at the beginning, got turned into an actual product that people use. There are other products that we build. So that kind of became something that all happened because of this idea of immersing yourself in customers and their problems and surfacing problems and then looking to solve it. And of course, I did write the second edition of the book, which was an updated version of that book. So a lot of these ideas had changed since the first edition, and so through those new sets of workshops, the book got refined yet one more time, and that's what that second edition really looks like. And so that's where I'll end, and we can switch over to do questions at this point. So Lana?
Ash, thank you so much. I want to see this. Thank you so much, Ash. Really appreciate it. Wonderful presentation. For those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please type them in, and I will share them with our presenter. Ash, we do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
The first says, you described 3 stages of a startup. Does the lean canvas make clear what stage a business is in? And is a new set of canvases appropriate for each stage?
So I will say that the lean canvas is meant to be it's meant to be a plan for your finished vision. So it's not about the 3 stages. So when you first do it, it's really how is this business model going to work? So I would say that's kind of your vision stage. So this is what the final story really looks like. Where the stages come in is there is actually, so I'll first give you the conceptual answer. The stages is really more within the canvas. There are certain boxes that matter more than others. So in my book, and also I have some blog posts where I begin to highlight the stages. So when you're in that first stage, it's really the problems and customer segments. And so what you do is you zoom into those boxes and you try to validate those assumptions. So am I tackling the right customers? Am I tackling the right problems? And that's what you solve in that first stage. When you go into the second stage, different boxes kind of surface as more important. So am I building the right solution? Am I articulating the right value proposition? Am I charging the right price? Those are 3 kinds of things that I usually talk about. When you go into that scale stage, you then start worrying about things like channels. Do I have cost-effective channels? Is my cost structure and revenue stream, do they kind of balance to have good enough margins in the business to make this really work? So you start testing those things. But the idea of the lean canvas is that on paper, day one, you should be able to tell a compelling enough story that this can work. And then in the 3 stages, you begin to hone in on those different aspects of the boxes and start really testing those assumptions.
Very good. Thank you. The next question is, what are the different engines of growth that you mentioned?
Sure. So as I mentioned, Eric's written kind of quite a bit on that, and if you even just Google engine of growth, you will probably find some of his posts. I've done a little bit of writing, but the 3 basic engines of growth, the first one is the paid engine of growth. And the idea behind the paid engine of growth is you are trying to, if you think of the funnel of your product, at the very top you have acquisition. So you're trying to acquire more customers. And in the paid engine of growth, you actually expend some money to acquire customers. So this might be in the form of advertising. It might be hiring salespeople. Even if you're using social media, which sometimes people count as a free channel, it requires quite a bit of human capital. So you're still paying salaries of people to blog for you or to manage your Twitter account. So that's still a paid form of acquisition. So you're paying some money to acquire new customers into your product. The math that has to work out there is the cost of acquisition, the cost of customer acquisition has to be less than the lifetime value of your customers. So that's the first engine of growth. And so if you can do that in a cost-effective manner, then you can just pump in money to get more customers and you will grow. The second engine of growth is the sticky engine of growth. And there what you want to do is trigger the retention aspect of your product. So if you can keep people longer using your product, then over time your product usage will, your number of users using your product will grow. So rather than keeping people for 3 months, if you can extend that to 9 months or a year, then your product will grow that way. And so classic examples there, some of these are forced stickiness. So you may have, when you subscribe to a magazine, they lock you into a 1-year or 2-year subscription. Same thing with cell phones. That's a way of ensuring that you don't go anywhere without a penalty. So they've kind of locked you in for that period. And if they do that in the front end, they can make their product more sticky. You sometimes have more organic stickiness. If your product is just that good, people just get stuck to your product either because of barriers of switching or because they like it enough to where they will kind of they will kind of be retained for a longer period of time. So that's the second engine of growth. And the third one, which you might have guessed by now, is the viral engine of growth. So that is triggering on the referral trigger. So using happy customers of yours to go acquire more people at the top of the funnel and then getting them through. So obvious example there is Facebook, which has inbuilt virality. For Facebook to be useful, you have to be talking to other friends, and so every person on average brings at least one other person, because otherwise the product isn't useful for that person. And that creates this viral engine of growth, which is, by the way, the fastest engine of growth.
Thank you, Ash. The next question is, how did you find early adopters? Were they just people who found your landing page or read your blog, or did you market your blog to a specific segment of potential customers?
Yeah, so it would be the second, is that oftentimes, it's the whole tree in the forest kind of metaphor, is that if we can build the best products in the world, but if we don't find a way for customers to beat a path to us, they never find us. So it is usually the latter, but the way that starts out is with the Canvas exercise. I often have entrepreneurs lay out who their customer segments are, and then there's a subsection below it called the early adopters. And there you want to get as specific as possible so you can understand. And there are other exercises that we do, like persona exercise, and that's what I mean by diving deep. But you can go into the personas of your early adopters and try to understand who they are, how they think, where they might hang out. And based on that, you would do certain placements. So in one of the products I built, it was targeted at parents at the very high level. But through kind of more interviews and more exploration, I found out that I was building a photo sharing app for busy parents, but the parents who were typically sharing or the parents who were most likely to be early adopters happened to be first-time moms with kids under the age of 3. And I can tell you kind of reasons why that was the case, but that was how specific we got. And once you have that as a early adopter definition versus parents, it gives you a lot of ideas on where you should go place your message. And so that's really the steps that you take there. You do have to do the work to go do it. Now remember that could be wrong, so you're running experiments there. So rather than saying, I now know who my early adopters are, I need to do this at scale, you can run a lot of very simple placements, invest a little bit of time or effort to see if those work. And if they do, then you do more of that. And if they don't, you come back and reassess and reevaluate.
Very good. The next question is it possible to employ the lean methodology if I already have started my business and have been operating for a number of years?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that gets asked a lot, because not all of us start from scratch. And the answer is absolutely yes. And I would say that sometimes it's even easier. So some of the challenges we run into with this process is when we just have an idea and you go run interviews, if you start to get that strong signal, people say, yes, if you build this, I want it. We get too nervous and anxious because we don't really have anything. So we now have to rush to go build this thing, and we're worried maybe the customer won't stick around. So those are like real challenges that we have, is we have to build and learn at the same time. But if you have an existing product, ideally that has some customers, in some ways that's a gift, because you can go to your existing customers and really turn the interview around. And so rather than saying, if I build this, will you use it? You just simply ask them, you're using my product, what do you like about it? What is the value proposition in their mind? And so you can use a variant of this interview to maybe even figure out which features. There might be an 80-20 rule, and I've had this with my own products where I've had a product that was very feature-rich, but what I found out is that my happiest customers were only using a very small portion of it. And all the other features that I was building, thinking I was making the product better, was really distracting them and getting in their way. And so once I had that insight, it helped me kind of, one, streamline the product so it matched their needs, but then keep that conversation going so I built more meaningful things for them. So having existing customers is definitely an advantage, and you can apply the same techniques. You just jump in at a slightly more latter stage. But the same challenges of product market fit and then scaling still apply.
Very good. Ash, there are actually several more questions. Why don't I commit to sending you those additional questions, and maybe we can answer offline. But I just want to thank you. This has just been a phenomenal presentation, and lots of comments and kudos to you from our listening audience. So thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And yes, please send me those questions. I'll try to answer them all offline and send them back.
Terrific. For those of you that are still on the line, I do want to let you know that the presentation and a recording of this entire webinar will be available, we hope, by this Friday at our fasttrac.org /authors page. And so I would encourage you to come back, take a look at the slides again, rewatch the webinar, and certainly share the information with your friends. I also want to invite everyone to join us in April. Our next author series will be on Wednesday, April 10th, and it will feature serial entrepreneur and author Mike Michalowicz, featuring his book, The Pumpkin Plan. Mike's a very entertaining presenter, and I know that you'll enjoy that session as well. So everyone, again, thank you for joining us for this edition of the Kauffman FastTrac Author Series, and have a wonderful day.